And in this population bottleneck, we have who is known as the Y chromosomal Adam, the man from whom pretty much every male on Earth has inherited their Y chromosome. And markers on the Y chromosome have made it easy for us to track migration since then. There's a wonderful book about this written by Spencer Wells, and there's also a documentary based off that book. It's right here. But around 60,000 years ago, the human population began to recover and migrate out of Africa again. And they seemingly took the same route as the pre-Toba successful migration. And they were apparently hugging the beach so tightly that, well, the first human remains found outside Africa after the Toba eruption are not in Asia, but all the way in Australia. So they were mostly, sticking by the coast. Although we don't have any archaeological evidence because it was pretty much reclaimed by the sea. Although we do have some evidence for the pre-Toba migration that they were, living a beachcombing lifestyle because we have actually found deposits of shellfish along with stone tools in Eritrea dated to about or over 100,000 years ago. But the first post-Toba migration out of Africa gave rise to who is now known as the Melanesians, the Australian Aborigines, and the Negritos in Southeast Asia. And we actually did some genetic analysis on a group of Negritos known as the Semang people, and some of them had mitochondrial DNA that was distinct from pretty much every other population on Earth. And it may very well be that while the Toba eruption nearly wiped out all the people who migrated out of Africa before that, some may have actually hung on and interbred with the second post-migration or post-Toba migration out of Africa, which is where the Semang would have gotten their mitochondrial DNA. Another mysterious fossil found in Australia was called the Mungo Man. He was found at Dry Lake Bed, and it was dated to I think 40 to 60,000 years ago, and he had a mitochondrial DNA that was distinct from everyone else on the planet. So he might have been descended from the pre-Toba migration out of Africa as well, although I don't think anyone's ever compared his DNA to Semang DNA to get an idea if that's true or not. But around 40 to 50,000 years ago back in Africa, some humans began a third migration out of Africa, this time taking the same route as the failed pre-Toba migration up the Nile into the Middle East, but this time they made it all the way into Central Asia. And there they began to, diverge. Some headed west, and those that headed west became the Caucasians. And just as a clarification point, Caucasian does not necessarily imply European. It encompasses pretty much everyone from Western Eurasia. That includes Middle Easterners and Indians as well. And the ones that headed east became the Orientals. Some migrated into the New World across the Bering Strait and became Native Americans. And as a side note, uh, when they migrated into Southeast Asia, and some actually made it all the way down to Australia, and they did interbreed with the descendants of the first post-Toba migration out of Africa. So a lot of the Negritos, Melanesians, and Australian Aborigines don't look exactly like the first people to migrate out of Africa after the Toba catastrophe. Some people who have been isolated so that they would have still looked like the first migrants, would include the Andamanese people and the Tasmanian Aborigines. Unfortunately, the last pure Tasmanian Aboriginal died in 1876. There are still some people who are descended from Tasmanian Aboriginals, but it's only a few percent of their DNA. But apparently, this first post-Toba migration out of Africa was indeed spread all throughout the south coast of Asia, because genetic analysis of some remote villages in India indicate that they do have the same genetic markers on their Y chromosome, or at least some of them have the same markers on the Y chromosome that the Tasmanian or the Australian Aboriginals, Melanesians, and Negritos have. And commonly, or what was commonly believed by paleoanthropologists, is that when humans migrated into an area occupied by another species of human, they would displace them. But recent genetic research has shown that this is not always the case, because it seems that our ancestors were getting freaky with other species. When the DNA of the Denisovans was extracted, it was compared with the DNA of every living group of people on the planet, and what the scientists found was that Australian Aboriginals and Melanesians actually inherited 4 to 6% of their DNA from the Denisovans. Although, interestingly enough, the Negritos did not. But it does seem that some of the members of this first post-Toba migration out of Africa were interbreeding with the Denisovans. As to why certain groups would have and others would not, well, that's kind of hard to infer, because we don't know the extent, or at least the geographical extent, of the Denisovans, because we only know them from one site. But if we were to find more fossils, we could maybe perhaps understand their range better, and also figure out why certain groups of the first post-Toba migration have DNA from the Denisovans while others do not. And when Neanderthal DNA was first extracted and analyzed, uh, it didn't seem to have any or it didn't seem like modern humans had inherited any from the Neanderthals. But that's because they were principally looking at the mitochondrial DNA. When they looked at the Y chromosome, it indicated that Caucasians had actually inherited 3 to 5% of their DNA from Neanderthals, and Orientals inherited 1 to 2%. And the fact that the evidence was found with the Y chromosome indicates that virtually all the pairings were Neanderthal male, Homo sapien female. Why this is, we could only guess. Some believe that it was because of rape, but I think a better explanation would be that when Neanderthals were competing with modern humans, oh, and just as a clarification point, when one species of human displaces another, it doesn't mean there was like a genocide, or because it really couldn't mean that, because a genocide has to be, organized and implemented, and it just can't be done by a bunch of nomadic cavemen. It's just that when one species is more successful than another, they just simply outcompete them. But I think a better reason for the uh, pairing arrangement between humans and Neanderthals was that when humans moved into the Neanderthals' territory, they created a lot of competition. The Neanderthal numbers dropped, and the Neanderthal troops were having a harder time finding Neanderthal females. And given the scarcity, they probably would have been willing to, take in Homo sapien females, because in most primates, males stay within the same group their whole life, and females will move to a different one to avoid inbreeding. And the Homo sapiens, though, because there were enough Homo sapien females, they would not have had any need to interbreed with female Neanderthals. While it makes sense that Orientals would have some Neanderthal DNA, albeit less than Caucasians, because their ancestors were living with Neanderthals when they lived in the Middle East, what's odd is that Orientals show no trace of DNA coming from the Denisovans, and given that the one site that Denisovans have been found in would be in the northwesternmost part of the Orient, and their descendants live now southeast of the Orient, it seems that they would have been living all over the Orient and thus would have been interbreeding with the ancestors of the Orientals, because the cave where they were found in was about 40,000 years old, and it was actually found with the remains of both Neanderthals and modern humans. So it is kind of strange that Orientals don't have any DNA coming from the Denisovans. Again, we can only speculate why that is. But as for Homo floresiensis, it doesn't seem that they were interbreeding with modern humans at all. There's no DNA evidence that indicates that there was kind of any intermixing between the two species, even though they were living together on the island for tens of thousands of years. But meanwhile, back in Africa, it turns out that not all of the Homo heidelbergensis necessarily evolved into Homo sapiens, and some populations apparently persisted past the Toba eruption and interbred with the ancestors of modern-day Africans. And this comes back to that comment that United Europa guy mentioned earlier. No, they were not. Africans were not interbreeding with Homo erectus. They were interbreeding with Homo heidelbergensis, and about 3% of their DNA comes from them. So basically, pretty much every person on Earth has some archaic human DNA in them, okay? Learn to embrace your inner caveman. The only people who might be considered pure Homo sapien are the San Bushmen, some of the native peoples of South Africa. And genetic studies have shown that they are the most genetically diverse group on the entire planet. In fact, it's believed that every other race of people are descended from this one group. So these people probably are what our common ancestors looked like, and it doesn't make a lot of sense because if you look at these people, their facial features carry characteristics of every, or pretty much every race on the planet. But not only that, genetic analysis of our autosomal DNA has indicated that when the human population bottlenecked, genetic diversity dropped so low that currently there is more genetic diversity within races than there is between or defining races. Basically what that means is if you, let's say you had 2 white people and 1 black person, there's only a slightly greater chance that one of those white people would be more closely related to the other white person than they would be to the black person. Okay, races weren't defined as they were, or aren't defined as they were thought to be in the past. I mean, prior to the Toba eruption, there may have been other subspecies of humans living throughout Africa, but these would have been wiped out, just leaving Homo sapiens sapiens, us. And our diversity is so low that racism has absolutely no genetic basis whatsoever.